So, good afternoon, everyone. We are soon going to start our fourth colloquium of the Parallel Worlds event that we are organizing in collaboration with the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, the Convergence Initiative, with the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and the support of the BRAIN program of the Research Institute of the McGill University Health Center, Healthy Brain and Healthy Life from McGill, Concordia University, and the Canadian Association for Neuroscience. I don't think I missed anyone. So the colloquium that we have today is YLM-MN Blue, Image in the Clouds, and is around the subject of pareidolia and abstraction. And I would just like briefly to let you know that this is the fourth and almost last one of our events. We have just one event more coming in August. So if you are missing the others, this is the opportunity to get in the last one. We will have all the recordings in the web also. We invite you as well to enjoy the tour that Stefan will talk a little bit more later, and to join what Convergence is doing and the mission that we have committed to the public knowledge of neuroscience and art, and promoting the cross-pollination between these two disciplines through different activities like the one that you are going to enjoy today. So that's my introduction to what is happening today. I will let you now with Stefan to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Christian. So my name is Stephen Legary. I'm the program officer for art therapy at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and the project partner of Christian. We've been working on this project for a couple of years now, along with the Convergence team, and this is chapter 4. And it just keeps getting more and more interesting. For those of you who have come back, thank you for rejoining us. And for those of you who are here for the first time, thank you for taking some time this afternoon. We've had a beautiful cloud-filled day in Montreal, from this morning where we had quite dramatic, foreboding skies of grays, and this afternoon has cleared to variable, and now, we almost have Renaissance skies. So I think it's very apropos that we're finding ourselves under a very abstract sky for our discussion today, and I'm personally looking really forward to diving in deeply with you. I'm going to put a link in the chat right away, and it is for the tour. Now, the tour is something that you can enjoy on your own time. It's to also direct you back to the Convergence site so that you can take advantage also of the workshops, which follow 1 week after all of our colloquiums. And so if you feel like getting your hands moving with the artists who are inspired by these topics, please join those workshops, but also please take the time to visit the tour. Our volunteer guides have worked really hard on the texts, and they've really explored the paintings, the sculptures, and the artworks from a perspective of great care and love for the fine arts. So please take the time to visit those. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our Montreal Museum of Fine Arts volunteer guide, who is going to help us explore this wild and fantastic subject today. So please give me a moment to provide a proper introduction. Sylvie Duyon did her medical studies at Université de Montréal, her residency in obstetrics and gynecology at Université de Montréal, and a 1-year fellowship in high-risk obstetrics at University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She then practiced for over 14 years at Hôpital du Sacré-Cœur de Montréal. In 2003, she did an MBA at HEC Montréal and started working at different hospitals as a health administrator. She retired during the summer of 2019, and in September of the same year, started a training with the Museum of Fine Arts here in Montreal and Concordia University, where our guides are trained, to become a volunteer guide. She enjoys visual arts and is herself an amateur artist working with acrylics, watercolors, and silk paper. She loves to travel and makes sure that she visits museums everywhere she goes. She particularly enjoyed the Mori Museum in Tokyo, the Shanghai Museum, and of course, Musée d'Orsay and the Louvre. She believes that art has an important calming role to play in these tumultuous times. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for being here, Sylvie.
Thank you.
And I will pass it back to Christian to introduce our other guest.
Okay, so thanks for that introduction of Sylvie. I'm going to introduce our counterpart in the neuroscience part. So we have the pleasure today to have Karim Jervy, who's a professor at the physiology department of the University of Montreal. He's a Canada researcher in computational neuroscience and cognitive neuroimaging and heads of UNIC, a neuro AI research center, unifying neuroscience and AI in Quebec. He obtained a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and brain imaging from the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris and a biomedical engineer degree from the University of Karlsruhe in Germany. His research lies at the crossroad between cognitive, computational, and clinical neuroscience. The goal of his research is first to elucidate the role of neuronal oscillations and large-scale neuronal communication in cognition, and two, to investigate brain network alterations in the case of psychiatric and neurological disorders. The multidisciplinary research conducted in his laboratory combines magnetoencephalography, scalp and intracranial electroencephalography with advanced signal processing and data analytics, including machine learning. Several ongoing projects in his lab use electrophysiological brain recordings to examine changes in the dynamic properties of large-scale brain networks across different states of consciousness. Dr. Jervy is also has a keen interest in the convergence between brain science, creativity, and art. He's also involved in several projects that employ sonification techniques to convert neural signal into audiovisual experiences. So with no further delay, I will let both of you guys to have your conversation and we will enjoy listening and participating.
So yes, thank you for introducing us. I will start first. I will share my screen and so I will start first by talking about the title of this presentation, because later on we'll talk about abstract art. And I have to tell you that abstract art is really one of my favorites. So this session is called Yinmin Blue. So what is Yinmin Blue exactly? So Yinmin Blue is called the new blue because it's a blue that was discovered it was the first blue that was discovered in the last 200 years. It was discovered in 2009. And it really filled a void that there was in the palette, the blue palette. So you see here most of the blues that are usually used by artists. And we see here that Yinmin Blue really brings something completely different. It's more durable than Prussian blue. And it's non-toxic. Cobalt blue, as you probably know about it, is a suspected carcinogen. It was discovered by serendipity by this professor in Oregon State University and his students. They were doing material science and they were trying to find a new material for electronics. So they mixed together yttrium, indium, manganese, and oxygen, and put them in an oven at 2000 degrees. And when they took it out, they came out with this beautiful blue color, and they were very surprised. So as you probably know, blue is the favorite color in the Western part of the world. Every year, there is a marketing survey which asks people, which is your favorite color? And over 40% of people answer blue. Blue is really the favorite color in this Western part of the world. And blue, of course, represents skies, represents the sea. The sky looks like it's blue. It's there's a lot of different lights in the sky, but it appears blue. And of course, in the sky, we see a lot of clouds. And sometimes when you see a cloud, you can recognize shapes. So maybe in this cloud, it's a little bit difficult to recognize a shape. But if we look at another cloud like this one, you probably can see a rabbit, right? Hopping over a hill. Or this cloud, we can see beautiful waves. So it's like the brain is trying to make sense of forms that are diffuse and don't mean anything. And this is called pareidolia. And I will let Karim maybe talk to you a little bit about pareidolia.
Thank you, Sylvie. Yeah, I can share my slides now and take it on from here for a few minutes. Here we go. Okay, so before I get to the term pareidolia, I'm just going to take a minute or two to discuss the notion of creativity, and then I'll come back to the link between creativity and pareidolia afterwards. But first of all, creativity as it is studied in particular in the field of neuroscience, trying to understand the neural basis of creativity. And I think we all agree that creativity is one of the most cherished and mysterious at the same time manifestations of the human mind. It's something that fascinates all of us. And there have been many attempts over the last 20 or 30 years to get a better grip on the neuronal basis or the brain mechanisms that underlie creativity. Again, a quick warning here about that if we go for the definition that is used by scientists in general, cognitive scientists or cognitive neuroscientists to explore creativity, it is often referred to as our ability to generate original and functional ideas. And so there are many things to be discussed here, and many people will disagree with this definition. This is a working definition that has proven to be useful for many studies onto the ability of human beings to be creative. But many of us could disagree that this doesn't capture the breadth of what we refer to when we talk about creativity, in particular in the field of art and artistic creativity, and particularly the idea of it having to be functional. And so this is something I'd be happy to discuss further, but because I would like to bring in the perspective of the scientists to the discussion, when we're talking about measuring creativity, there's the idea that you'd like to measure how can we quantify a person's ability to be creative. And most of the time what is being used are tests, cognitive tests. One example is the Guilford's Alternative Use Test, which measures the ability to think, to have a form of divergent thinking. In other words, for example, if you're given a tool, how many different uses can you imagine for that tool? Or if you're given a word, how many different related words can you find to that word? Basically trying to see how divergent you can think and not just follow some automation. The other thing that we're interested in measuring, again, is the neural basis of creativity. And the way we do that simply is by using imaging devices such as functional MRI or electroencephalography, measuring the electrical fields generated by the brain, or magnetoencephalography. And here we're measuring the magnetic fields created by the brain during, for example, processes that involve creativity. Okay, what do these brain activations or patterns of activity look like when an individual is engaged in a creative process? And just to give you one example here, I won't go into details, I don't have the time, but there are studies that have looked at, for example, what happens in the brain of a musician who's improvising. Creative improvisation, for example, in a jazz musician playing an instrument. And these are typical examples of studies that have been conducted. So that was just a quick word about creativity. Now to the term that is of central importance to our discussion today with Sylvie and with all of you, the notion of pareidolia. As Sylvie mentioned before, typically when you look at the sky, you see these clouds. Sylvie showed you a bunny or a rabbit. I'm showing you here a teddy bear. you see an object that presumably wasn't intended by nature to be there. It's not that nature decided to draw a bear for us, but we actually see something that isn't there in the structure. And this happens in many examples of our daily lives. I'm sure you've all witnessed things where you see an object and this reminds you of something else that you're seeing and it wasn't intended to. It's your brain that is perceiving something and creating these percepts for you. They are not there in the structure, but it's just the way our brain is wired that we always look for patterns. We used to look into processing faces. So we have areas in the brain like the fusiform face area. There is experts in identifying and looking at faces and face characteristics. And so our brain is wired in a way that is constantly looking for these patterns. And so even if these patterns don't exist, it might be able to put pieces together and constitute these patterns because that's what the brain does. And this is also another example that I like, again, showing pareidolia. So now I'm nearly done with my brief introduction. How does pareidolia relate to the notion of creativity? The way that we could think about this is that pareidolia, and this is, I'll come to work by Antoine Bellemare in the lab in a second. The idea is to suggest that pareidolia, this ability to see objects in an image where those structures are not even present, is a form of divergent perception. Now, you might remember that a few slides earlier, I told you that one aspect that is important in creativity is divergent thinking. So our ability to use, as I said, take a concept or take a tool and imagine many different uses for this tool, right? So to be creative in the way we apply an idea on an object or a tool. And so that's sort of more of like a constructive creation or ideation. But pareidolia, you're faced with an ambiguous stimulus, right? But your brain sees something in it. But it might be able to see a second thing or a third thing. So how many different things can you see in just the same stimulus that does not even contain a structure? That, we argue, is a form of divergent perception. And so the question here is there a link between your ability to see these things? Like, for example, all of you listening to us, when you look up at the clouds, is there a link between your ability to see objects in the clouds and your creative abilities? Is a creative person, does a creative person have would they see more objects in the same scene than a person that is less creative, be it an artist or not? So this is an open question, and this is something that we've been looking into over the last year or so with two great students in the lab, Antoine Bellemare and Yann Harel, University of Montreal and Concordia. And the idea is to probe the creative mind through pareidolia. And so we run tests on individuals. We look at their ability, their creative abilities using standard tests. But then we give them a pareidolia task where we show them stimuli. And we look at how many objects they can see, how many percepts emerge to them when they look at these ambiguous stimuli. And the question is there a link between how creative they are and how high they score on these creative questionnaires and tests on one hand, and how often they see percepts in an ambiguous stimulus that doesn't even contain them. So how their ability to have this pareidolic percept. I won't tell you about the details of the study, but the short conclusion of what we saw so far, and this is the work led by Antoine and Yann, is that yes, indeed, individuals who score higher on creativity tests do have a tendency to see many more percepts in the same ambiguous stimuli. And this is the examples here of the stimuli that we use that mimic basically clouds, but in a very controlled manner, because we're using fractal dimensions that we're controlling of these images. And I'd be happy to discuss the technical details if someone is interested later. So now I'm finishing off with the question that many have been asking. Okay, well, when I'm looking at the sky and I see a bear as a pareidolic effect, I wasn't really looking for a bear, right? It just popped out of the sky. I just saw a bear, or I saw a rabbit in the sky. And so this brings the question is of whether pareidolia is an active process. Can it be an active process, or is it more of a passive process? I think this is something that is also interesting with regards to the pieces of art that we'll be discussing later. How much of this is intentional? How much of this is something that is intended by the artist? How much is unconscious? Same way for the person that is looking at the object of art. How much of this, of what they see is because we want to see something, so we're looking for something in the image, and how much of it just pops out to us, so we're sort of more of passive in that sense. And so does creativity require consciousness? This is an open question. I won't have time to go into the detail, but I know we have time today in our discussion, maybe later also to go into more subjects that are of interest to you. Many people or many scientists also believe that it's a combination or a mixture here of consciousness, of conscious and unconscious processes that go into most of our complex tasks that we conduct. And so creativity might be regarded as this instructive example of that kind of cooperation between the process, the conscious and the unconscious processes. In this case, unconscious would be generating the pieces, and the consciousness would be actually putting them together in a creative product. A final word, we're looking a lot at artificial intelligence nowadays in neuroscience. And so an open question is the link between creativity and artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of creative work that is based and relies on using artificial intelligence. And the other way around too, there's a lot of creativity that goes into artificial agents. And this opens super exciting questions that I'd also be happy to discuss of whether, for example, we can consider an artificial intelligence to be creative. Can we say that it is creative? Can we say that it produces art when we look at something created by an artificial intelligence? That's an open question. That was just the quick word that I wanted to mention regarding this. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope I just launched some also hints to some topics or questions that I'd be very happy, I think, with Sylvie to discuss with all of you. Maybe some of them later on at the end of the meeting, after we've discussed the different objects of art and paintings that Sylvie will be discussing. Thanks.
Okay, so I will share my screen. So today we'll talk a lot about abstract art and semi-abstract art. And abstraction, what is the definition of abstraction? It's a departure from reality in depiction of imagery in art. And the departure from accurate representation can be slight, partial, or complete. And how come painters were able to make abstraction? You know that with the advances of photography that began around 1850, it freed painters. Painters before their goals was to represent reality as much as possible. And with photography, they were not, they did not have to do this anymore. So it brought something better, something freer, and then they could start doing impressionism, and they could start doing also abstract work. So I'll first bring you to this part of the Museum of the Fine Arts, and it's called Pavillon Claire et Marc Bourgy, and it's a beautiful pavilion which is completely dedicated to Quebec and Canadian art. It has 6 floors, and it was built in 2011 for the 150th birthday of the museum. And if we go on the 4th floor, this floor is completely dedicated to Inuit art. So of course, when we talk Inuit art, when we think about Inuit art, we think about sculptures, but there are also some prints and some paintings. So we'll first look at a semi-abstract sculpture. This sculpture was done by this artist, which is still living. He was born in 1949. His name is Georges Arluc, and he comes from Nunavut. And he likes to work mostly with soapstone or steatite and ivory. And we can see him here in action trying to saw a piece of soapstone. He works more often in Cape Dorset, in Nunavut or Kittengate. Now he lives in Winnipeg, but he spent most of his life in Cape Dorset. Cape Dorset is in Nunavut. Nunavut is a territory that is governed by Inuit. And if you see Manitoba's here, so Nunavut is northeast of Manitoba. So we'll look at this sculpture, which is called the Shaman. And it's a really interesting piece of art because it's very puzzling. You look at it and you're not sure what to make out of it. So, but if we look closely, maybe here there's a human head and arms that we see on both sides. And here on the bottom part, probably an animal head with an arm also here. If we look really closely at the human head, we can see that the two eyes that are here and the nose, and this is the tongue made of ivory sticking out of the mouth with the two arms. If we look at the lower part, we can see probably it's a bear with his eyes here, the nose, the tongue again, and teeth made of ivory sticking out. So we could call this a semi-abstract work because we recognize some things and some other things we don't recognize. And I think semi-abstraction was really good for the subject of this sculpture, which is a shaman. And a shaman is a very important person in Inuit culture. It's someone who is a healer, a psychological healer, physical healer. He can also talk to the spirits. He can also have magical powers. He can go to the moon and back, swim underseas for a long time, and he can also transform into an animal. So this is probably what we're seeing here. He is transforming, fusing into an animal form. So I think this is a very interesting first semi-abstract work. If we go now to abstraction, it's important to talk about Fritz Brandner. So Fritz Brandner was born in Germany in 1896, and he died in 1969 in Montreal. And he fought in World War I. He was made prisoner of France. When he was freed, he had a training in art in Berlin, where he was really influenced by Kandinsky, the German Expressionism, Bauhaus, Cubism also, and Surrealism. And he decided to immigrate to Canada. He first came to Winnipeg, and it was not a really good experience for him in Winnipeg. He showed abstract art, and people didn't understand what he was showing. They thought his work was really not really interesting for them, and the critics were very harsh. So then he moved to Montreal, and that's where he became a local celebrity. So in Montreal, he showed his art, which was well accepted. He also worked at McGill University. He was a professor at the art department there. And he also did humanitarian work with Normand Betium. He was teaching unprivileged children how to paint. And he was really an important person because he was the first to show abstract art in Canada, first painter. So we'll look at his first painting. So this is called The Storm. We think he did that around 1950. And this is quite a dark painting. We see a lot of circular movements, chaos. Black is predominant, and it gives really an impression of depth and tumult. And this is a really nice example of lyrical abstraction. We can say that there are two main types of abstraction. There's lyrical abstraction and geometrical abstraction. So this is lyrical abstraction that was popularized by the automatist group with Refus Global and Paul-Émile Bordua. in Montreal. So for lyrical abstraction, it's really important that the painter expresses what he has in his subconscious. And it doesn't go through his reason, it goes directly on the canvas. Usually they paint extremely fast and they don't think about the result. So this is a nice example of this kind of abstraction. So we would like to ask you to participate if you want, to write in the chat if you see things. Can you recognize shapes? Can you recognize something in this painting? And while you write, I maybe can tell you what I see. At first, I didn't see much, but then I could see maybe an eye here, another one here, and maybe the contour of a sort of a beast here. So I want to see what you think. And probably the painter painted this when he was feeling extremely anxious, lots of angst. Maybe he was remembering the war and the bad experiences in the war. But also when I saw this painting, I remembered how we all felt at the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't know where the world was going. Everything was chaotic, everything was very dark. So even if it was done in 1950, it could have been done like a few months ago.
We have a few reflections, Sylvie.
Yes,
we have,
go ahead, please.
A skull on the left superior side.
Mm-hmm.
We have bird, a peacock losing its feathers in the middle of a storm.
Okay.
I see lungs, les poumons.
Lungs, okay.
I see meanders, white flow of water like rivers. I see multiple human faces, a big bare head that covers almost all the paint, front facing, and also a face of a man that could resemble Leonard Cohen.
Oh.
Lights reflected in a puddle on a street. I see ghosts. I see a distorted face lower center.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Do you have any comments, Karim? I guess we have very creative people in the audience.
Absolutely. That's exciting, and that's going to cater for a great conversation afterwards with everyone. Yeah, I think this shows also the diversity in how this is like an example of like collective pareidolia, where you're just showing one object and it has one single structure. Nothing is dynamic, nothing is changing, and you get 15 different answers when you ask 15 different people. And clearly in each one of these suggestions or ideas, there's so many things that factor in that relate to our experience. Also anything we might live through, also our how much we've been looking into and interpreting art, whether we've done that or not. And so it's just so many, it's so subjective in a way. And I think it's quite fascinating that something, if you could quantify the objective details of such an object of art, but then it gives rise to so many subjective experiences that it just is super fascinating.
Okay, so we'll go to the next painting. So this is a lino engraving. It was made also by Fritz Brentner, and it was made a little later in 1968. And I think he was really influenced by the group Plasticien. We'll talk a little bit later about the Plasticien group, which is a very interesting group. And this is completely different from the other painting that we just saw. Everything is really well planned and well thought of. We see darker colors, and we have an impression of 3D. The darker color recede, the lighter color come forward. And we also have complementary colors that are put together, orange and blue. Orange and blue are complementary colors. There's also purple and yellow, and there's also red and green. And when you put complementary colors together, it's very pleasant to the eye, and it gives right away a sense of harmony. So in this picture, in this painting, I will ask you again, if you see something, please share in the chat. I will share what I feel when I see this painting. I feel sort of happy. It sparks joys, probably because of the complementary color. And what I see a sort of a toolbox with a ruler here and maybe some rope and some things that you can use and a horseshoe. That's what I see. So I don't know, Stéphane, you're ready to share?
Yes, we have some wonderful reflections coming in. Please, whatever words occur to you, there are no wrong reflections or wrong answers. So I said I see wrestlers. I see someone transferring from a car seat to a wheelchair. I see letters. I see an R and an A and a D hiding. Draftsman's tools. A nose in the udder of a cow. A hockey stick. The heel of a shoe. A chair. Tools for a turn of the century surgeon. I also see a bull riding in the back. You can see his leg in the inferior right corner. I see a distorted face with an eye and a smiling mouth. I see a gas pump, a shark in the middle with its mouth wide open.
Okay, very interesting. Karim, do you have anything to say?
No, all I have to say is I personally see lovers entwined and embracing, but that's you, but I don't have anything else to add. But again, it's just super fascinating, the breadth of all we see. And I think the longer we look, we can also discover more and more things. And this is exactly the experiment we did, as I said, in Pareidolia in the lab, where we just show one image and we ask participants to enumerate how many percepts they see. And if you do that exercise, I think you can also train to do that. And you can train to become even better at seeing more details and seeing more percepts, changing your angle of vision and what you incorporate and what you don't into single structures or into multiple structures.
Okay, so we'll go to the next painter. So this is Joran, or Rodolphe de Repentigny. So he's a painter that didn't live for very long. He died at 33 years old of a mountain climbing accident, but he was a very polyvalent person. He studied mathematics and psychology at Université de Montréal and then philosophy at the Sorbonne. He was a painter, a humanist, an art critic, a scholar, a theoretician, and a photographer. And he was very attached to existentialism. And what was really important for him is that artists really show authenticity. And he is the author of the Manifeste des Plasticiens with 3 other painters, Louis Belzile, Jean-Paul Gérôme, and Fernand Toupin. And the Plasticien group differ completely from the Automatist group because they don't want anything about this subconscious or this just painting. Painting is important, the subject is not important. We do it quickly and we do what we feel. For him, research, aesthetic research, plastic research was extremely important. So form, color, textures, relationships between the elements were of the utmost importance. So we see a painting that he presented for the first time at the first Plasticien exhibition in Montreal in 1953. So in this painting, we see polygonal forms that are overlapping. There are not too many colors, and there's a nice light gray background. The visual activity is well balanced, and there is no formal hierarchy or direction. And the result is really clean with a sense of harmony. Joran was influenced by Georges Braque and Cubism and the Paris School. But he focuses on the angular form, which was often put aside in the Cubist language. So for him, angles were really important, not only cubes. So I would like to share maybe what I feel. I feel this is a very relaxing painting. Its name is Equilibrium, and I really feel maybe like after a yoga lesson or something. And what I see two people. I see a woman here, a man, the sun, and a lake behind. So we will ask you again, what do you see in this painting? So Stéphane, when you're ready.
We've got some great comments coming in. I see stones flying in the air, completely unaware of the heavy role society assigned to them. I see two trees and the sun on the top. Île de Pâques. I also see a couple taking a walk. Un enfant debout parlant à sa mère assis. I see two people, two lovers, sitting, and cloud. I see balance in stride. Oh, I have a couple more. I also see two people, not sure if they are women or men, but the smaller person is menacing and the taller person is afraid. On top, I see a cloud, and on the back, a coffin. I see two elephant legs, a mother and daughter fishing under a cloud. Voilà.
Very interesting. Anything to say, Karim?
Actually, I was just wondering while looking at this myself, beyond the visual, what this inspires or what we think that this might represent, I was thinking about emotions. And I think that this is also something that, you know, sometimes sometimes it's easier for us to pinpoint towards an emotion that an image triggers without even knowing what exactly is in the image, and then we can search longer. So I was just wondering whether we can maybe ask again what emotions this painting evokes in the audience, just to maybe even if we have just a couple of answers, I'd be curious to see what emotions, what feelings this painting evokes.
We have obscure peace, fear, conflict, anger, nostalgia, solitude, nostalgia again, peace, calm, happiness.
So, okay, that's super interesting, because again here, you know, it seems, I don't know what Sylvie thinks, but we often associate colors also with emotions. We started off this discussion by talking about blue. Here we have a painting where we have, I'm not an expert in colors, so I won't be able to pinpoint, but rather say gray, shades of gray, black, maybe it's a bluish gray. But we often would relate these to sort of maybe more like negative sounding emotions. And this is, I think, what most of the words came up with. We did have a couple like peace, calm, and that's maybe more related to the minimalism and the very few components, but also from Stéphane, happiness. So again, I think this shows how, you know, how individual experiences and how wide these single objects or percepts can actually evoke so many different feelings in this case, rather than visual perceptions. I don't know what Sylvie thinks about.
Yes. So, you know, there's this artist, which is a sculptor, is still living. His name is Jeff Koons. And he says, when the artist finishes something, it's finished, but it's not complete. It gets complete when someone views it and comes with all his background, his feelings, how he is that day, and then the painting is complete. So I think a painting is just a suggestion that the painter puts out, and then you can see whatever you want. You can make out, we can make out whatever you want.
And often probably also relates to our current, not only our experience and the way we see, you know, our senses have evolved and what experience we went through, but also our current concerns. If we're in a period where we're stressed out because of work, or maybe we're, you know, maybe in a relationship with someone and going in one direction or the other direction, or, you know, so many things that might be happening that we might see reflections of those thoughts unconsciously in our interpretations of works of art. So
exactly. So that's why I like abstract art so much, because you're alone in front of this painting and you can really see whatever you want. And that's what we saw today, I think.
Absolutely.
So these are the 3 paintings that we saw.
I see there's also a question by Trish in the chat, but I also did get comments from Christian suggesting we should keep most of our answers, well, at least discuss some of these questions in the conversation with everyone later. So I will.
So I'm finished presenting my paintings, so we can go ahead.
So if you guys are ready, then we can start to share some of the questions that people has been posing. So I will start with the first one, then we let Stefan go with the second one. So the first one was from Jihan. She asked, are there any neurological conditions that make people not see any patterns or images in objects?
So I think this question is for me, and I gave a beginning of an answer in the chat, but basically, as I said, I'm not aware of this effect. So where people that are entirely unable to have the pareidolia experience, but as I said, it's a continuum. So some people will have a strong propensity to see objects and see many objects in an image, or an abstract image in particular, in an ambiguous image. And others will see less. People that are entirely unable to see any pattern, I'm not quite sure of a neurological disorder that would relate to, but the other direction is also super interesting. So neurological disorders where people have a tendency to see a lot of objects that aren't there. So obviously, many of you now are thinking about the concept of hallucination. That's typical to psychosis. So we're talking about schizophrenia, for instance. And there are interesting links between mental illnesses or conditions like schizophrenia and creativity. But pareidolia, that is a specific example of something where, if you're doing a study on pareidolia, in one of our questionnaires, we try to also make sure we exclude people that are maybe at risk of psychotic experiences, because that might induce individuals who experience hallucinations that could maybe lead to enhanced effects in terms of perception. So there is definitely a link, Jihan, to answer your question in that direction. Now, the other direction, I'm not quite sure, but in that direction for sure.
Karin, concerning to the same question that Jihan is asking, what about people with agnosias that are not able to recognize faces, for example, or objects? So they can recognize objects by the name or the sound or the touch, but not by the visualization of them, or the same thing with agnosias that have to do with faces. So would that correlate to what Jihan said? Maybe give some.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends. So agnosia is the idea is the ability not to recognize. So there is this ability to recognize someone, but they do recognize that it's a face. So you see it's a face, but you're not able to associate it with a person or recognize that you know this person. So in pareidolia, it's not necessarily identifying someone's face, but actually you see a face in the moon when you look up at the moon, and this is something most of us have done. You'll see a face, someone argue it's male, female, or any other gender, but basically you see a face there. You're not really identifying it. So, but it would be interesting to see if people who suffer from face agnosia, if they are unable, or if they score weaker on a pareidolia experiment. Definitely worth looking into.
I have a question for Sylvie. It's actually, it's a question coming from me.
Okay.
I've observed so many fascinating responses to abstract art. And we know that abstract art writ large is far too big a subject to encompass it with that title. But if we could just stay in that generality for a moment. Sometimes abstract art can be incredibly polarizing in terms of emotions, the ability to enter the painting. I'd like to ask you about your own relationship to abstraction. Is it something that has changed over time in terms of your relationship to abstract art? Do you like it? Do you hate it? What is your point of entry with abstraction?
Yes. So I think before my training, I was a little bit ambivalent, you know, like most people, I think. You see an abstract painting and you're wondering, what did the painter want to show? What is the point of looking at this painting? But I think the more you look at it, the more you see things and the more you can feel things also. I think it's very nice to look at abstract art.
So it has changed. So
it has changed. It has changed.
Okay.
Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And I think it's really important, this concept of pareidolia, because when I see visitors that come to the museum and they're a little bit reticent to look at abstract art, because either you have people who really like it or people who are like, I don't know. I think when you ask them, do you really see something? How does it make you feel? Then they can, you know, be more attracted to the painting and like it a little bit more.
That reminds me of the need to sort of reduce threat. That my own wondering about pareidolia is this a nascent desire to find meaning or to find structure in something that is abstract, which is a threat. It is something that I don't feel comfortable with, and therefore I need to find something structural inside of it. But I'm hogging the mic. Christian, you pass it. You go on.
That's a great view, by the way. I think that because one of the things that when I read about creativity, one of the problems that the field of creativity has is how to eliminate all the other signals that are making the brain also activate that are not related with creativity. Anyway, so I want Nora, because Nora posed a very good question here, but it's too long and I think she has to make it. So go ahead, Nora. Take your question. You're mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, I'm going to try and rephrase this. So I'm wondering about creativity. When Karim was talking about creativity and what is it, and I was thinking about predictive processing models and how, and it, you know, is being creative like, okay, so, you know, we get all of this sensory information and then like, or get it all in order so that we can actually do something or think the thing that's gonna, you know, maybe make us survive another day. And is creativity where you say, no, I don't care, I'm good. I don't need the right or best response. I just want that wacko notion that I came up with. So is it a aberration in the predictive processing modeling that we do, or totally opposite that, maybe I'm not thinking of this right, is our survival based on the fact that we can come up with like completely sort of non-obvious out there models, and that's going to increase our ability to survive as humans. So is creativity like we're in such a luxurious place as humans now in evolution that we don't have to be oriented to our own survival, or is this an enhanced mechanism of survival? And what does predictive processing, do you think, have to do with that? That's my question.
Thank you. There's like 25 questions bundled up into
I know,
one.
it's a mess.
But no, but that makes it exciting, and I wish we had 5 or 6 hours to go over this, but maybe we can take it in, you know, different sessions. But there are many things in there to unpack. But I love, so first of all, there's the idea where you're talking about survival. You mentioned the word survival a number of times, and so So that is a question already. We need to discuss first again the definition of creativity. And creativity, there are creative ways of surviving. Is it a luxury? At some point you also asked. And so is it something we need to do to survive? Or is it something that we started doing because we're not worrying anymore about survival? Those are very two different things. And I think both are probably true, depends on how you define creativity. So there might be creative ways of helping your species continue and thrive, or make sure that you don't get into danger. If you're in a very complex situation, you're surrounded by threat or by danger or animals that want to eat you up, you might have to be very creative to get yourself out of that situation, right? So that's sort of the creativity for survival. And I think again that would be close to the idea of defining creativity as finding alternate uses of a concept, an idea, or a tool, thinking outside the box, if you will, and so divergent thinking, for instance. But I also think that creativity is something that, and I'm going to use the term pleasure. I think it's a pleasurable experience. And so it might also be driven by pleasure. So for example, a teenager that decides to dress entirely different from everybody else in the class and actually experiences pleasure by doing that is being creative, but it's a rewarding process. The teenager is not doing that because they think I'm going to feel good about doing it. It just happens that they feel that urge to be different. Obviously, it's getting more and more complicated because everybody's being different. So you have all these subgroups. And so if either you're part of the metalheads or the goths or the whatever, and the technos and so on, but then you need to think about something else if you want to be different from all those subgroups. But anyway, I think the urge is in some people is there to want to stand out. Now, why do you want to do that? Is we can go into a whole other discussion of why do people want to be different in the first place? And is it the same type of reaction that's going to drive an artist that is going to study art, know about all the different current streams and schools of art, but decide to come up with something entirely different? Is that comparable to a teenager's psychology in this other kind? I have no idea. And I feel that I'm not really answering your question, but there was just so many things in your question that
there's so many things, and just to append on, someone wrote an article or a paper all about like why would we be drawn to like horror films, because that's actually not pleasurable at all. But I think that I don't know what the connection is. I think that this all has. There are some links, and I wish I had an hour to sit down and talk with you, but okay.
Oh,
anyway, thank you.
We need to find ways to continue these conversations anyway. So I'll be happy if
cool.
we can sort of formalize this somehow, or have like I don't know, once a month, a creativity and science cafe or some sort. So.
Oh, that would be awesome. Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
I think they'll get some cafe customers, Karim. I'd like to actually invite Simon to open their microphone and ask this question, because I don't think I could do it justice. It's a language I don't speak. Simon, would you do that for us?
Yes. Is my microphone working? I think it is.
Yes, thank you.
Marvelous. So my question is kind of about you, Karim, you touched a bit on AI and machine learning and so on, and how it relates to, I guess, the way we perceive things and the way we kind of find patterns and things. So recently, in the past few months, there's been a development by OpenAI, a new machine learning model that does essentially image recognition or image classification, but in a very different way than how we did it previously. And the catch is that instead of putting images into preset buckets of this is a cat, this is a car, this is a lawnmower, and I only understand these 3 categories of things, it associates things with the way we describe them. It bridges language and visual understanding. And it does it in a very, very, very efficient way. And you can spin that around and make it into something that can create images given a prompt. And the results you get out of that are really shocking, because if you get creative with your prompts, you can create things that essentially look either like something very figurative or something very abstract or something in the middle. And the things it produces, like, it's very much like in that sweet spot of pareidolia. I can't pronounce this right, but it's in that sweet spot where it's not made by a human, it's made by a machine that kind of got together a bunch of some vague sense of intuition about how things visually work and how you relate to language, and it mashed this thing together, and it produces a visual output that has some things you can assign to and some things you can recognize, but there's no clear intent to it. And there's not someone that's putting this together intentionally. So it's kind of a super interesting thing for art, I think. And I happen to be an artist and a machine learning student at the Masters at McGill. And I'm very much interested in taking this and making art out of it. And I'm kind of really curious to kind of have a take on, like from a psychology and neuroscience perspective, like, what is this? Like, how can we compare maybe the way these models learn and how they create like a visual understanding of things versus how is our understanding built? And there's like a million questions I could spin up from this. But yeah, if that's enough to feed on, I'd be really curious to have your response.
Yeah, so many of us have seen like I think it was also by OpenAI, but for example, the fact that you can generate images by descriptors. So this is probably related to the clip that you're mentioning. And for example, so that everybody can follow, you'd say, for example, avocado and chair. And this would create many types of chairs that are inspired by the form or the colors of an avocado. And so this is typically the dream or the nightmare of object designers who are just designing new objects, right, or furniture and so on. And so you could actually just put those, say, I want a table and a pineapple, and then it's going to create very artistic, ideas of what a pineapple table would look like. So this relates somehow, but I definitely think that this is super interesting for art in terms of generating visual imagery that feeds on text description. And I think what would be super interesting is also to imagine having individuals that describe paintings that they see, use those descriptions, and then feed them into these algorithms and see what these algorithms generate, and how what parallels do we see between the actual source of that description and what the algorithm generates. And yeah, so I think that in many directions that this can go, but also your question was related, if I get it right, also to the psychology and cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience aspects to this. And I think language and vision are related. The way we process every day, we see objects and the way we describe them, there is a direct link between speech, between language semantics, and the way we process visual information. So can we use such algorithms maybe to harness more, to expand our understanding of how these processes happen in biological intelligence based on AI? Maybe, but maybe we can go the other way around and try to come up with more sophisticated algorithms that embody more realistic and more naturalistic inspirations from the human brain or an animal brain in the way they are exploring this. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to, what is your goal? Do you want to come up with a new form of art expression through AI that is mimicking some processes in the brain of how the brain combines speech processing, language processing, and vision? Or are you seeking to expand the capabilities of these algorithms by doing that? It really depends on what your final aim is. But I definitely think as a tool to explore, this is just amazing for artists or people like you who are interested both in AI and using GANs and deep dream algorithms, for example, and exploring how that relates to artists. So but to go back to the question that I asked in my very brief presentation, one question that relates to all of this is, which is not your question, but is one of my questions, is at what moment, what needs to happen so that you can say that I have an algorithm that is creative or that is actually producing art? Of course, we would need to define what is art, which is a completely other question, but does there have to be an intention? You know, can you say, well, it's not art because my algorithm did not intend to create something that just appeals to others or to itself, or just, you know, or if it happens without an intention, but somebody sees it and think this is amazing. So it's that art created by an AI. Anyway, so there's a lot of open questions there, but they're just, you know, fun to discuss.
Yeah, and if I can add just a tiny thing, like what completely blew my mind when I saw this is that, like, this crosses the line where if I show you an image produced by this algorithm and upscaled and processed the right way, and I don't tell you if, like, either it's an algorithm or a person that created it, I would not be able to tell what is what. Especially if I tell it to paint some things that are much more ambiguous or contradictory, or things that use metaphors and so on. Like, it has an understanding of what metaphors are to a certain degree, and understanding, because AI understanding is not human understanding, and they're very different. So it's an interesting thing to play around, because, like, then what is the role of the artist? Like, does intention matter? What is going on? And the other thing is, you can have that, like, come from nothing, like come out of nowhere in like 2 or 3 minutes. You have your image generated there, and you can see it unfold before your eyes. So again, it's like, it's almost like un bien de consommation. It's almost like something expandable. It's like you can generate 1 million of these. And again, like, as an artist, you're confronted to that. So there's like something that's kind of shocking about it, I think. But yes, so, and again, the fact that you can make these so quickly, it creates a situation where it doesn't need to be static. It can be dynamic. You can create art like on the fly for someone who's participating and interacting with what you're creating.
I think it's a super interesting question. And I think part of this boils down to, does it matter to you as a person looking at an object of art, or looking at the paintings that Sylvie presented today? Does it matter to know whether this was created by a human being or not a human being? And even if it's not a human being, does it matter to know that that algorithm intended to create this so that you could look at it and appreciate it, so in a purely aesthetic objective? Or it came out of some processing, crunching numbers from the financial, you know, or looking at the any sort of medical data, and it just happens to have this form, but you actually find it pleasurable to watch? Does it matter how this came? Which is, I understand, a completely different question than what we're looking into today, but, you know, ultimately most of these discussions go back to what is art, and what is intentional, what is not intentional, and the conscious versus the unconscious components of creativity.
So leaving a little bit the computers out, I want to go to one point that Sylvie was talking to, that it feels really interesting to me. It's about the two types of abstraction that can be practiced in art. Sylvie mentioned that was a lyrical abstraction, that was what we were observing right in the paintings of the person that presented today, and then geometrical abstraction. And I would like your comment a little bit more on that, because that's new for me. What is the process behind these two types? And is any difference between the people that practicing this kind of art, this kind of abstraction?
Okay, so lyrical abstraction was there before geometrical abstraction. And what's really important in lyrical abstraction is that there are no rules, and the subconscious is really doing everything. It can come also from dreams, and it doesn't go through reason. And usually the painter paints really fast without thinking. They just have a feeling that comes up, or an image in their head, and it's just painting really fast. And this came mostly with in Montreal with the Refus Global group, the automatistes. And at that time in society, it was really the clergy that was controlling everything. There were a lot of rules, and the painters didn't want to have any rules, even in society. So I think it reflects this in their paintings. Geometrical abstraction came later. I think the painters that were doing this geometrical abstraction were maybe a little bit tired of this lyrical abstraction. They felt like it was like, what is it? It's nothing, you know, you're just doing anything. It doesn't make sense. And aesthetic research really became important. So it was a sort of research, you know, that they were doing. So everything was really well planned. And they tried a lot of different things, different colors, shapes together. So that's why it's really different.
So that made me think a little bit in what was mentioned before, right? Like how creativity tried to stand out of something, like to respond to something, to always kind of differentiate from something else. And bring me to the question also of, again, bringing pareidolia and you, Karin was saying that you guys trying to link pareidolia to creativity. So is then pareidolia a sign of creativity, but could be also creativity instigate pareidolia? So how you know which one is the egg and which one is the chicken?
Well, that's a good point, but so I'm not quite sure that pareidolia would per se drive creativity, but as I said, it could be an exercise. So for example, you could train yourself to become better on a pareidolia task. And by doing so, you might be able to sort of enhance your visual creativity in a sense. So, and I don't think it's a problem for this to go both ways. So you can, in that sense, you know, you could say goes both ways. But I think the notion, and this is something that Antoine Bellemare in the group came up with, the idea of divergent perception is something that I like a lot, because creativity has been often explored as divergent thinking. And the perception creation duo has been left out a bit of discussion. Some scientists and some researchers have looked into this, but it has not been studied much. And so by taking pareidolia as one form of perception and trying to find a relationship between your ability to perceive and your skills on a task of pareidolia and your scores on on several creativity assessments, this is again linking. It's not just my ability to produce, but actually just my ability to perceive different things. And this is why I like the idea of divergent perception, because it's not seeing things for what they are, but for what they could be potentially. And this is something that I think speaks to many artists, is looking at something and just seeing all the possibilities that could be or could turn into. So I think the boring answer to your question is that I think it goes both ways. So it's the chicken and the egg back to the chicken and the egg.
Actually, I do like that, because usually we in the scientific process, we always go from here trying to go there. And that's something that we have kind of learned from the arts, right? That you can actually go in all this direction, and it doesn't matter because you still produce new things. And if we are studying something like creativity, then that was my observation there. Like if pareidolia was a sign that you were more creative, or actually when you are creative, you are more pareidolic, let's say. But yeah, so Stefan, your turn.
All right, I'll see if I can link this question to my own interest as well. Sylvia, I'd like to start with you with this question. It actually comes from Trish, and it relates to somewhat, I would say, of an evolutionary function of being able to see a face, right? And we saw this in Karim's presentation too, that we're predisposed to find faces in everything. And I wonder if you would put on your other hat for a moment to make a comment about children that are born with sight. Are they predisposed to find faces as a form of attachment? And what do you think about that statement?
Okay, okay, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think it's really important that a baby, when it's born, gets attached to his mother. And I think the first thing he sees usually is the mother's face and the mother's eyes and the mouth. So that's probably the first thing that he gets attached to. And the opposite also is true. When the mother sees the baby face the baby has a special face, very round face, very round eyes, a mouth that's a little bit big, and it develops the attachment connection between the mother and the baby. Yes. So it's really important. Thank you.
Can I sort of lob the same question over to Karim, if that's one that you'd like to entertain? Would you, it's sometimes not fair to ask a scientist if they would care to just, riff on something, but what about this idea that we're predisposed to find faces perhaps as an evolutionary function or as an attachment function?
I think I would agree with Sylvie that it's important, and I think we do that, but we probably do that for many reasons. There's also, we're going to make sure that the face that we're seeing, is it a familiar face, is it a friendly face, or is it a dangerous, is it somebody we don't know? And I think it's also because we're also social animals, like human beings. The basis of our community, the way we interact is with others. And so being able to identify individuals, but also to read emotions on other people's faces is just so important to whatever we do, the whole day long, that we need to be good at that to thrive in society and make sure that we read people's intentions properly. We know if they're happy, if they're angry, if they agree with what we're saying, if they seem to be interested in what we're telling them, and so on. So, which by the way makes all of these Zoom sessions over the last year and a half sometimes tricky, with everybody not showing their faces. And so you're just talking, and you're hoping that people are thinking, that's interesting, but you don't know. But yes, so the short answer to that is yes, I think it's super important, and it might relate to our first encounters with faces, and the way that has evolved over the years, and our experience with handling different types of faces. Some people might be paying more attention to faces than others. We know that there are also conditions. There are children that are neurotypical, others that might have, for example, autism, or others that are less into the social interaction, have other strengths. And so, yeah, that might be something that factors into to all of this.
Thank you. Christian, over to you.
Yes, we have a really interesting question from Arefet Sherafati. How does creativity in abstract art different from creativity in sciences? Let's start with that one. Comments from Sylvie, Karim?
Maybe Sylvie wants to start first, and I'll also add a little bit something, or I'll come to you for Sylvie.
It's a difficult question. Please go ahead, Karim. Go first.
So I think they are different, but I think creativity exists in both. So again, it might depend on how you define creativity, but if you're searching for a solution to a problem and you want to come up with an innovative and a new way to solve a problem, because most of maybe the traditional methods have failed, then what you're actually de facto doing is you're being creative and trying to come up with a new solution to that problem, or you're coming up with alternative solutions, and then you want to compare them to see which one works best. So with the boring definition of creativity, that would be creativity, because you're looking for alternate solutions to a given problem, and you would like to come up with solutions out of the box that maybe even come with better results than other solutions, other options. But I think also, and this is a discussion that I had not too long ago with Shihan, who's also here, we discussed a bit about how those two forms of creativity can actually be useful to one another. So you can, in your work as a scientist or a student, a researcher, whatever you're doing in a field where there are specific rules and constraints about what is correct and what is incorrect, it can also be very useful for let's say, inspiring creative energy when you have time to maybe invest your energy into creative or artistic forms of creativity. So I'm not sure I'm explaining this correctly, but I think that if you have a sensitivity to art and art creation, You might bring that with you into the scientific domain and be inclined to say, okay, well, this seems to work, but why don't we just try this completely stupid idea? I think everybody thinks it's stupid, but I'm, you know, it's Sunday evening and I'm bored, I'm going to try it out. And then you might come up with something really cool. And in the other direction also, if you're a scientist that has some interest in art, you know, you might, maybe you like to play music, but you don't really get time for it, but you have so much work to do. But then after several weeks of, you know, finishing up your paper and submitting it, and then you have all of a sudden an afternoon for yourself to play your instrument, you might find all this energy come out just because it has been, you know, stuck for 3 weeks, not able to just touch your guitar or your drums or whatever. And then all of a sudden that energy liberates all this, you know, maybe thoughts, impressions that you have. Many of them may be unconscious. And so that is inspiring. So I think this was not exactly the question, but I'm thinking that, you know, they can help each other out. They're different forms of creativity, but I think in some cases they can go hand in hand.
It was my turn, or it's your turn, Stefan? I'm lost now.
Oh, we need a novel creative solution to this problem. Nora's posted another question, a little bit about dreaming and sleep and creativity. Have you come across anything that would show heightened activity in delta waves in dreaming? And perhaps you can define, if someone can help define what delta waves are, because maybe not everyone knows. Heightened delta waves in dreaming and creativity in waking hours.
Again, this is a super interesting question. We've been doing research on sleep and also on dreaming. And so we have been comparing individuals that say they remember their dreams a lot, looking at the brain activity during sleep and comparing that to individuals that don't recall or say that they hardly ever remember their dreams. Now, as you probably all know or would guess, it's super difficult to actually know whether the individuals actually did dream or not, because those who say they did not have any dreams, they might have just forgotten their dreams, right? So it's about dream recall. So what we can study in the lab, we can ask individuals how many times a week they remember their dreams or a month, and then we can invite these individuals to experiments. And this is a study that is that we've been doing in collaboration with a team in Lyon, in France. And so we compare their activity, but we don't have any measures of creativity in these individuals, which would have been really super interesting. We're only comparing the brain signals during the night across these two groups, a group that says that they remember their dreams at least 3 or 4 times a week, and another group that says it's going to be less than 3 or 4 times a month. And so we compare those and we look at things like delta waves. And so to answer Stefan, delta waves are slow oscillations. So there's periodic activity in brain signals that occur around between 2 and 4 hertz. So these are like 2 or 4 bumps per second. And that is one of the different oscillations, many oscillations that happen during sleep and activity in different frequencies and rhythms. So unfortunately, I can't answer the question of whether creativity depends on these delta waves during sleep or during dreaming. But my intuition would be that highly creative individuals might have, you know, also very creative dreams and maybe more complex dreams. But I have absolutely no proof or evidence for that.
Can I give just brief context? I'll just give, it just might add a little something to it. I was watching a video art piece and I was checking out like a feedback loop with just like a little sensor. And I was like, this is so weird. Why are the delta waves more pronounced than everything else? Am I just super relaxed watching this video art, or am I experiencing like, is this an indication of like creative thought? Why, if they're associated more with the activity during sleep? And so the question was, I don't know what, I couldn't get a control factor. Maybe I was just super relaxed. But anyway, I'd be super interested in knowing if there was a connection between dreaming, which honestly seems like one of the most creative times ever, when you're thinking of stuff you'd never think of during waking hours, and then the act of actually witnessing creative work and engaging the mind creatively. Anyway, I don't know the answer, and I'd really like to figure that out.
Yeah, from an art point of view, there's Salvador Dali, you know, and for him, increasing his creativity, he was always like almost going to sleep and then having something wake him up. And he thought that what he thought of just before going to sleep was the best thing he was thinking of in terms of creativity. So I don't know if there's delta waves just before you fall asleep. So that's an interesting.
If I absolutely agree with Sylvie, and if I may, I think also that I'm not quite sure. It's difficult to say whether what we experience in our dreams is super creative, because it's actually sounds like it's crazy sometimes. For like you'd be in one context talking to people that actually belong to another context, or all of a sudden you get up on a horse and start flying or something. So these things, it sounds weird. We need to probably make sure we differentiate between what is sort of unrealistic and what is creative, because in some cases, even in the cases of, for example, hallucinating, or in cases under psychedelic effects, people might be experiencing things. There's a long ongoing debate whether, for example, you are actually in a higher state of consciousness under LSD, for instance. And many argue that you might be in a lower state of consciousness, not a higher state of consciousness, simply because biologically, what is happening in the brain, you have these connectivity between your different brain areas, and the properties of long-range connectivity that are actually maybe you might have less communication between different brain areas. So your thoughts might be allowed to be more random and less structured. Does not necessarily mean that you're getting to something even higher than, so sort of like in a hyper or a better state of consciousness. Rather, it's sort of more like more of a breakdown. So not everybody agrees on this, but there's a debate on whether the effect of psychedelic drugs, for instance, is actually taking you to a sort of a better place or a higher state of consciousness, where you actually all of a sudden get enlightened and see things, or simply playing a trick on you because you're seeing all these random ideas, they're not connecting anymore as they should be, and things are allowed to be more free, less constrained. So if your wall or your chair starts talking to you, it's just because it obeys less restrictions and less rules under that state. Now, does that make it higher level of consciousness? That's a whole other debate. But I think something similar is also true for dreaming. Is that more creative, less creative because it has less constraints? It's an interesting question.
Okay, so we will go with the last question. It's already almost 7, 6 hours more for Karim that is in France right now. So Anne-Marie, you have your hand up. So would you like to close our session with your questions today? We have tons of questions, but guys, you can hold them and then in opportunity we'll arrive to them. So Anne-Marie, your question.
It's more of a thought about what we just discussed, delta waves, creativity, and pre-processing. I was wondering if the delta waves could be a biomarker for maybe not pre-process creativity, but like the flow, like and consciousness, like could delta waves be like the bridge towards this kind of states of connectivity between brain regions? I'd like to know what you think about it, Karim.
Yeah, it's a tough question because we don't know, and I'm not sure whether specifically delta waves are would be the best marker or the best signature to look at, but they could be. So So yeah, so I have to say I don't know, and I'm not quite sure what the experiment would look like. So obviously we need to do an experiment, but maybe you would like to come up with what experiment you would do to address that. It would be also easier to maybe make some predictions, or what your hypothesis would be.
I'll think about it.
Unfortunately, I don't. Well, I mean, that's the good thing. There's so many things that still need to be addressed that we don't know. But I mean, looking at brain signals at the same time as individuals engage in creative or in pareidolia experience, or looking at objects of art or paintings like the four that Sylvie presented today, I think that's one of the new frontiers where we are sort of slowly also now like trying to explore brain activity in naturalistic conditions, such as looking at objects of art or engaging in a creative activity or creative perception per se.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So just to remind you, first of all, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks so much, Sylvie, for your amazing work. The presentation of the artworks was really, really inspiring. Thank you, Karen, for making the time, especially from France and your vacations, to be here to share all your research. I want to also, guys, invite you, especially if you're interested in the subject of pareidolia, next Saturday is the workshop in pareidolia, and it's actually guided by Antoine Belmar, a student of Karen. So the subject continues. If you want, you can register right now on the Convergence website for the workshop that is going to happen next week around this subject. So he had planned already several really interesting activities to play with you guys in this. And our last colloquium for this series is in August 13, Friday, August 13 at 5:30. So register now. It's the last opportunity you have to see our speakers from the science and from the arts in parallel in live, because after that we will put all this online for you to enjoy. Finally, and last announcement, especially if you are a neuroscience student from grad programs from any university in Montreal, we are offering again the Convergence course where we talk all these subjects during 2-semester course. So if you want to learn more about that, next Friday we have an information session. You can register this course as a grad student from McGill, University of Montreal, UQAM, or Concordia, especially if you are in the neuroscience part or you are interested in neuroscience part, and you can get credits for this course through the BCI system in Quebec. If you are an artist, you can register through Concordia University as part of the Faculty of Fine Arts. Nora is already registered there. So I can wait for the questions from Nora. I will have to study so much to reply to all these amazing questions. So that's it. So if you have any other question, please direct it to us to info@convergenceinitiative.org and check our website, www.convergenceinitiative.org for more information about what we are doing. So Stefan,
Yes. Well, I'll say my own word of encouragement is that go see some art, get out to your local galleries, go support artists at this time, go to museums, they're open, they're air conditioned, and take the learning, take the questions and the learning that have happened, whether this is your first colloquium or your fourth colloquium. It really does change the way that we encounter the fine arts. Go see some abstraction. The Canadian and Quebec collection is open at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Go encounter some of these works in real life and refresh your eyes, especially you neuroscience students.
Buy some art from living people. Buy art from living people, both for people that support science. Go ahead. So thank you so much for staying here. Sylvie, Karim, I don't know if you want to say something else before we finish.
Thank you. It was really nice to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun, and as I mentioned, I think Christian and also Stefan, we need to think of how this can be done more often and in a different context, and maybe, as I said, like a cafe once a month or maybe once every 2 months, where we specifically look at some of these like neuroscience and some specific creative processes like this. Soon we can hope that maybe we can even meet in person and have a coffee or a beer together and discuss these things. I think that would be great. And again, thanks to the Convergence Initiative for like doing this in Montreal. And
we're working that already, so you will receive a call very soon.
Good.
Okay, guys, have a great afternoon. Enjoy your afternoon, your evening. Bye-bye.